we go. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. So go ahead and take your notes out. We're going to be continuing looking at the Cold War during the time period of 1961 through 1976, and specific focus on Cuba. Wow, this is fascinating because in the other class, my 11th grade class, we were also talking about Cuba, how the United States came to kick the Spanish out of Cuba. And we'll be following up in the, you guys remember that from last year? Oh, such a long time ago, last year, when I could see your smiling faces. And actually, I can still see your smiling faces. I'm not saying anything. Shh. Actually, Daniel, thank you very much for providing this, because I'm just like, this was one of the ones that you sent me, you gave me. And I can actually breathe in it, although there's still an issue. Yeah, he's laughing. Yeah, and it's nasty because it's like a little bit of like Mr. Hansen's breath on here actually does make it nasty, and so I'll have to like wipe it down and so forth. But at least like last period, I wasn't having to go like this so much, right? So thank you on that. I think we still have some things to try and solve, but alas, we're doing our best. Right, Tara? We're doing our best, right? We are equipping ourselves with what we need to be successful and successfully open doors to our future and to North Star. So bring your little like swipey things so that you can always get them. Don't just leave it in your wallet somewhere at home. You lost yours. Ask for another one. Well, try again. If at first you don't succeed, try. Try 3 more times? Yeah, try again. And Daniel, yeah, bring yours from your thing. Okay. You guys can get the doors open, can't you? The outside doors? The little swipey things? Nobody's been able to like, okay, no. All right. Okay. Thank you guys very much. We've had good meetings so far, actually with 2 of you guys in here and another student. And yeah, and continue getting those scheduled as you get in turn. I think I've got a paper from all of you, so thank you very much. A couple of students in the at-home group, I need to get those in from you, and then we can schedule Zoom meetings so that I can give you what you need to do before it's due on December 18th. And so far, would you say that what you have to do, for the 2 that I've met, would you say that is an onerous burden? The instructions I gave you on what do you need to do for your final draft? As in like really bad? No. No, okay, so that's good. So which is a reminder, it's like, thank you. And thank you for getting a lot of the work done ahead of time so you don't have as much to do. Because goodness knows, what would you be thinking of doing as a senior in your first semester as far as schoolwork? Yeah, Ellie's like, there's plenty, okay? There is plenty. All right, so we'll keep on keeping on here. Questions, comments? Okay, let's get to it. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Did you watch the Cold War video that I posted to follow up on that? We'll have another CNN Cold War video on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm guessing we can probably get through all of this, right, with due diligence. I've got two pages of notes here to cover the Cuban Missile Crisis. Are you ready? Here we go. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which officially occurred in 1962 in October, right? That was when, you can write this down, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, there were people who surmised that that was it. The world was going to be over. The United States and the Soviet Union were finally going to go to full combat. The United States military forces were going to be in close proximity and, in fact, engage Soviet military forces. And the first contact was likely to take place in the Atlantic Ocean as United States naval ships surrounded Cuba. We called it a quarantine. Literally, President Kennedy called it a quarantine. Isn't that nice? We're having a quarantine with guns. Okay, it was like a blockade. And meanwhile, the Soviets had ships heading toward Cuba. What are the Soviets doing having ships heading toward Cuba? Well, that was like their BFF in the Americas, as we will tell in the story today. How did Cuba end up being a close ally of the Soviet Union? And from here on out, you're going to be hearing, and especially in the CNN videos, you're going to be hearing a lot from, raise your hand if you can tell me, who was, he died not too long ago, who was the leader of communism in Cuba? Fidel Castro. And when the CNN Cold War video was done, he was still a fairly, healthy man, young-ish. I mean, the CNN Cold War video, I want to say was done, let me see, I think I've got that written down. No, I don't have the dates on that. I want to say like about 20 years ago or so. And he was one of the primary source people who was interviewed. All right, let's do a quick OPBL. Sage, what is a potential value as a documentarian of having the participation of Fidel Castro, the communist leader of Cuba? He is a primary source, yeah. So what's valuable about that? He can tell you what his experience was. He was there. A lot of these different kinds of things, he was there, right? What's a potential limitation? Bias. That's why when you're watching this, it's always fascinating. And you have to do this. I've hopefully trained you to do this like throughout your life. When you hear from somebody who was there, don't necessarily always take it as the absolute, total, unvarnished truth without any bias whatsoever. So I always have kind of a chuckle when I hear Fidel Castro, because I'm like, actually, this is really interesting and so forth, but how much of this? He's very emphatic. He would have a hard time trying to give speeches, a teacher, instruct, and so forth, because you hear it when he's interviewing. Boom, boom, boom. Very interesting guy. So we're going to be talking a lot about Fidel Castro in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll be talking about Fidel Castro in things having to do with Africa, for goodness sakes. Because write this down. Cuba is going to be the most active Soviet ally. And if there's like a special job, for the Soviets, that they need one of their allies to carry out, like, I don't know, engage in a proxy war in Africa or something, Cubans are up for it. Because you can put this down as well. Fidel Castro hates the United States of America and what it stands for, and is willing to engage in combat against the United States of America and what it stands for and what our allies stand for. And so he is a very, very active participant in helping the Soviets. In fact, sometimes it's weird because you'll hear him say, well, the Soviets didn't want me to do this, but I did it anyway. And I always wonder, is that what we're supposed to think because you say that? Or how much cooperation was there and coordination between the Soviet Union and Cuba? Right? Because sometimes the Soviets might want to say, hey, it's not me. I can't stop Fidel Castro from doing what he's going to do. Is that deniability? Or, how much of the responsibility goes back on him? Anyway, enjoy. Take a close look because you will see Fidel Castro is an active and interested participant in this Cold War video series, this documentary series, and especially with this particular episode, but others as we go forward. Okay? Good news. Write this down. The Cuban Missile Crisis will not lead to the destruction of the planet as we know it. You're like, really? I had to write that down? The world is not going to be destroyed like before you are born, Mr. Hansen, or before any of you were born? Actually, it's like, too much information. I was born in August of 1963. Back up the calendar. Yeah. Literally 9 months before that, we were just getting over the Cuban Missile Crisis. The October Cuban Missile Crisis. And I want you to write this down as well. In the context of American politics, it occurred during an American election. When do American, federal, national elections take place? Even-numbered years or odd-numbered years? Even-numbered years. What is 1962? An even-numbered year. Was there a presidential election that year? No. Kennedy had been in there for 2 years, all right? But there were congressional elections, and actually, you can be like, really, Mr. Hansen brings a context of his family and so forth into all these things. My dad Orville Hanson, was running for Congress that year in 1962. And the Cuban Missile Crisis arguably led to his defeat. In a close race for the United States House of Representatives for Idaho's 2nd Congressional District, so like Boise all the way to the Wyoming border, he lost. And one of the reasons perhaps was because in a close race, and back in those days actually the Democratic Party was much stronger in Idaho. You're like, really? Yeah, I mean Frank Church, Democrat, was elected in 1956 and continued to serve and get elected, and we had Democrat governors and so forth. So it wasn't like, nowadays it's like Republicans pretty much always win in Idaho. But in 1962, my dad had a close race with the Democrat for the House of Representatives seat. And there was a lot of people, a lot of voters that kind of rallied around the president and arguably his political party. And what is the political party of the president of the United States at that time? The Democrats, yeah. So my dad lost in 1962, right? And the joke supposedly in the family was when he lost in the first Tuesday of the month of November, I was the consolation prize. Because I came 9 months afterwards. And the next time he ran for Congress, he won. But then he lost, later on. So these are some things that are kind of going on, and that is like, that's interesting, like a family kind of thing. Like, would that have made any difference? I don't know. Could have. Who knows? But let's get to the detail, shall we? The part that you really have to know in order to write essays and so forth about this. Okay? Let's take what we know. Did Cuba gain its independence from the Spanish-American War? Yes. Did the United States? Oh, let's see if you guys remember this one. Did the United States promise if we beat the Spanish and kick them out of Cuba that Cuba gets to be independent? We did. Yes. It was like with an asterisk. All right, help me out here. Who wants to volunteer and explain? First of all, what was the amendment to the resolution that we were going to go to war that said that Cuba, you get to be independent? Anybody remember that? Do I have to tell you? No. Teller. The Teller Amendment was the one the Cubans like. Write it down. The Teller, T-E-L-L-E-R. The Teller Amendment was the one the Cubans like. That was the one where the United States said, yeah, okay, in this situation, yeah, we're going to hand over power to the Cubans after we kick the Spanish out. And we did. Right? That was only one of the 4 places that we kicked the Spanish out. We held on to the Philippines for like another half a century, and we still have Puerto Rico and Guam. But we got out of Cuba pretty quick. Although we did put another one. Some of you guys said it correctly. What was that other amendment that sort of took it back a bit? The Platt Amendment. Write that down. Anybody remember what the Platt Amendment said? Very good. We kept military bases. And in fact, do we still have a military base in Cuba? Yes, we do. Anybody know the name of the military base? Sometimes it's referred to simply as Gitmo. Very good. Guantanamo Bay. If you want to see an excellent drama movie of like JAG Corps and so forth, the military. It's set in Guantanamo Bay. It's got Tom Cruise as a young attorney. It's got Jack Nicholson as the Marine Corps colonel who's in charge of the U.S. presence in Guantanamo Bay. And there's this great court scene and so forth where Tom Cruise is cross-examining Jack Nicholson, and he says to Jack Nicholson, "I want the truth." Anybody know what the response is from the colonel? No. You guys need to watch that movie. It's called A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. And what was the truth? Anyway, I'm not going to give the whole thing away and so forth. But the context is, write this down. The United States kept a military presence in Guantanamo Bay throughout that time period, and we still have it today. And that is an intense location, especially during the Cold War. The terms of the Platt Amendment were the United States could intervene in Cuban affairs to protect the Cuban government from outside influence. Eventually, we got rid of that part because the Cubans were like, that's not very nice. We would like to be in charge of our own national security. Another part of that agreement was the United States gets to have a military base. And the only way that that military base is going to go away is if both sides agree for the United States to remove the military base. Got that? So why is there still a military base there? Because America still wants there. And it's interesting because, I don't think Trump wants to remove it, but there was some discussion during the presidency of Barack Obama, and he was like, maybe we should close down Guantanamo Bay. And he talked about it. But then ultimately, as commander-in-chief, he kept it open. Because if you're on the United States soil, the United States Constitution applies. And so there are certain types of things that, like habeas corpus. No, not the torture part. Shh. Enhanced interrogation techniques. What are you talking about? Anyway, but I mean, like, if you're held in the United States, right, habeas corpus, we have to charge you, right? We have to charge you. Otherwise, let you go. We have to tell you why we're holding you there. Well, it's difficult with terrorists and so forth because it's kind of hard to put together a criminal case that you can take to a jury and win beyond a reasonable doubt. When you show up at some terrorist site and so forth, you see these bad guys and you're like, oh, I don't know, they look dangerous. Where are we going to send them? Gitmo. So we still have a fair amount, although some of them, a lot of them have been returned to other countries, and sometimes now they're wherever. Okay? All right. So let's back it up. Cuba's government, write this down. Cuba's government going into the 1950s, we're going to skip quite a few decades there, but going into the 1950s, the government of Cuba is very friendly to the United States and United States economic interest. You understand that? Okay. I've got this picture here of our United States President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the Cuban President, Batista. Fulgencio, is that pronounced right? Fulgencio Batista. Okay? He is the leader of Cuba. He is very pro-U.S. economic interests. So, for example, you had a lot of people going back and forth, and Americans would go to Cuba. It was a nice place to vacation and so forth, and a lot of American companies had interest in Cuba, and so the American business interests were well taken care of by the Cuban government. Got that? So, question. Did anyone have a problem with the Batista government in Cuba? Yeah, as it turns out, a lot of the poor people in Cuba, because it was not like a super protective or open democracy. And it didn't do much as far as protecting the rights and interests of poor people. And so what did Batista have on his hands? He had an insurrection on his hands. By January 8th, 1959, Batista was removed from office. He lost the war against the insurrection. And who was leading the insurrection? Well, it's not being supported by the United States of America, that's for darn sure. Who's leading the insurrection? Well, let's identify some of the key people. These three guys right here. We're going to talk about them. The brothers Castro and Che Guevara. Yes, Che Guevara. Which of them lived the longest? Actually, Raul Castro. I think he's still alive. He's very, very old. I want to say he's the younger brother of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 and ruled for a long time in Cuba. These are the revolutionary leaders in Cuba. Che Guevara, we're going to keep an eye on him too. He died the youngest. He helped Cuba to have a successful revolution, but he's going to be one of those guys that's sort of sent out to get involved in other things in other parts of the world. So, for example, you'll see him pop up in Africa with Cuban troops and so forth fighting against some pro-Western government or forces. He'll eventually meet his demise in Bolivia because he ends up falling under the control of the enemy, or his enemy, and they kill him. Right? So if you ever see T-shirts, the young revolutionary leader, Che Guevara. You see Che's picture on all these various different things. The Castros, they reached old age, and they got old. And eventually Fidel Castro did die. I think he sort of retired a little bit before he died. What happens when Castro and the revolutionaries win the war in Cuba? Big things happen. You ready? The losers, many of the people of the Batista regime, are going to be executed. Okay? And the thing is, it's a lot of the Cubans, this is an important thing to remember, a lot of poor Cubans and so forth very much support Castro and his regime, his new government, because he institutes all kinds of various different social changes and things. Be sure that you understand that. It's not like he's bringing in open democracy and the respect for all kinds of various different human rights. But there's definitely going to be an economic change. So poor people aren't going to be as poor. Health care is going to be more provided and so forth. But if you want to criticize it, that's not going to work out very well for you. Not in Cuba. I mean, if you criticize Batista, you're in big trouble. If you criticize Castro, you're going to be in big trouble. And so write this down. A lot of thousands of Cubans leave Cuba. They leave voluntarily, or many of them are exiled. And of course, some of them are thinking, well, I'm glad I didn't get killed. Many of them go to, anybody know what state in the United States of America? Florida has a very, very, probably the highest concentration of Cuban Americans. And many of them came there during the time of the Cuban Revolution and the time aftermath. So guess what their attitude is toward communists? They hate them. They really do, especially in the old days. Maybe not so much now, it's kind of passed along a little bit, but especially in the 1960s and so forth. All right? Now, here is something that Castro and his folks immediately instituted. Land reform. All right, Melody, what does land reform mean when it's instituted in a country in Latin America? Oh, you're so nice. Giving it back to the original owners now. Yeah. And let's just say it this way. If you can't really identify original owners, because the original owners, you might say, well, those would be actually people who are descended from slaves who were brought over, African descents that were brought over. They were never the owners. They were brought over to Cuba to work. I mean, if you talk about people who are, some of the indigenous, you can say, well, they owned like in a community and so forth, but that was a long, long time ago. Make sure it's clear. New owners. Or actually, the government is going to be the new owner on behalf of the people. So who's not going to be the owner? Anybody who owned it previously under the Batista regime. And so some of those will be Cubans that will have their land taken away. And most of those are going to be either exiled or they'll get out of there because they don't want to be, those are the losers. And then you also have some American companies. Write that down. You've got a lot of American companies that had land in Cuba, and those are going to be all nationalized. This is very different. Make a little note of this. This is very different from, say, like what happened in Mexico. In Mexico, were a lot of U.S. assets ultimately taken over by the Mexican government? Yes. So why do we not feel as bad about that? They paid us, yeah. Did the American companies get paid by the Cuban government? No. That's actually an unresolved issue still today. Because the government in Cuba is still that same governmental system and so forth from those days. So even though President Obama had said and normalized relations, Congress still has restrictions on trade and so forth with Cuba. Part of that is because of bad human rights effort or history in Cuba, but part of it is this unresolved thing. There are American corporations that have outstanding lawsuits to basically say, we want to be compensated for what was taken away from us by Castro. Zach, you had your hand up, sorry.
Oh, well, I mean, it's kind of partially related, but not really. I'm just curious, so obviously there were native American tribes in what's now America, but so did all those Caribbean islands also have native?
Yes, they did. They did. It's interesting when you do a demographic of the island of Hispaniola where Columbus first arrived. I think, someone can prove me wrong, I think there's very little evidence of a large number of people there. The population mostly died off because of disease and overwork, and demographically the population was mostly replaced by African slaves that were brought in. If you go to other parts, like in Mexico, we talked about this before, other parts of Mexico, you can still see high percentages of indigenous people. So it's an interesting mix. Yeah. Cuba does have a pretty high percentage of people of African heritage. So like if you look at the Cuban Olympic teams and so forth, and you look at the athletes out there, boxers and runners and so forth, or Caribbean runners like Usain Bolt, very fast, right? From Jamaica, I think. What's most of his heritage? I would say it's mostly the African heritage and so forth there. Okay? All right. So, Castro, new leader, young leader, dynamic, comes. He speaks. You'll see this in the video. He comes to the United Nations. How can he come to the United Nations? That's in New York City. How does he have the right to come to the United States and speak at the United Nations? How is that possible? We don't like him. He helped to overthrow a friend, or Batista. Do we have to let people who we really don't like into our country to make speeches at the United Nations? Yes, write that down. Yeah, I mean, we do. We do, yeah. They fly into New York, they go to the United Nations, and it's almost like this this diplomatic, world, anybody can kind of come and go sort of thing. As a leader of a country, we're not going to let Osama bin Laden show up and go, hey, I want to give a speech at the United Nations. Forget that. Very quickly, write this down. Castro makes friends with this guy right here. I mean, I love this picture because it says, yeah, that's a friendly relationship. There's Khrushchev. Khrushchev loves the fact that Castro overthrew the Batista regime in Cuba that was friendly to the United States. He also loves the fact that Castro is, a left-wing politician revolutionary. And he is going to be persuaded that the Soviet Union should support the new Cuban government. Write that down. The new Cuban government is concerned, and they should be. The new Cuban government's like, we gained power, but how long are we going to hold on to power? Who might be trying to overthrow us? Who potentially was actually making plans to overthrow the Castro regime? The U.S., exactly. The United States of America. Those plans started during the time of President Eisenhower. Okay? They will not be carried out until the time of the next president. That's where it's going to get a little sticky. So, what does Castro want from Khrushchev? Military support. Does that make a difference? If the Soviets say, you're our friend and we will do everything in our power to protect you, what does that potentially mean? You could potentially go to nuclear war. That's going to be one of those really weird things, because Cuba didn't start out the Cold War as a friend of the Soviets. They will only become friends of the Soviets during Khrushchev's time. Will the United States take a chance to try and overthrow the Castro regime? Initially we do. Okay? Initially we do. Some of the first things we do, though, we cut trade with Cuba. Okay? We don't buy their sugar anymore, or their tobacco, or anything else they're growing, especially as they continue to nationalize all these various different industries. And the U.S. businesses are like, that's terrible. So we embargo Cuba. We literally, and we try to get as many of our friends and so forth, allies around the world, to embargo Cuba. So one of those interesting things today, is it legal in the United States to purchase and import Cuban cigars? Anybody know? It's still illegal. Where can you buy Cuban cigars? In Cuba. And you can buy them just about every single other country in the world. Because, I mean, even as we went to the end of the Cold War, we're like, no, we're not going to ease up. No, we're not going to ease up. And other countries are like, oh my gosh, they're communists and they're still communists. I mean, hello, the Chinese are communists and so forth. I mean, like, some of you guys might remember this from the 10th grade. Why in American politics does it seem like there was still, throughout these presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and so forth, all the way down here, really all the way up until Barack Obama, well after the Cold War's over, why is there still like this anti-Cuban communist government thing that we don't want to trade with them? What's that all about? Remember? I'll tell you the clue. It has to do with winning one critically big swing state in a presidential election. Florida. And what is a decisive swing vote in Florida that could turn the election one way or another? Cuba. George Bush won a close election in 2000. And it was nice because after that close election, eventually Al Gore said, you won. I mean, it took about a month and a Supreme Court decision. You won. Hopefully that'll happen the same this year. That one side or the other will go, you won, and the other side will go, thanks. I'll be either staying in the White House or moving into the White House as of January 20th. That's an important issue, because that actually, the question was asked of Trump the other day. Is there going to be a nice smooth transition and so forth if you lose?
What happens if you lose?
It gets really messy, because that's never happened. We've had all kinds of presidents. John Adams was the first president to be defeated running for re-election. I mean, that was in the days of Hamilton. I mean, my gosh. Hamilton, friend of Adams, basically said, hey, Adams is like giving it up. The only fight there was like whether it was going to be Jefferson or Burr. Mia's not here because she's doing her thing. His deceitful, scheming vice presidential running mate. So here's the deal. During Bill Clinton's presidency, there was some people that tried to escape from Cuba. You've heard me tell the story before. Some of you guys remember from the 10th grade. And Elian Gonzalez barely made it onto the shores of Florida and moved in quickly with his relatives in Florida, having escaped. His mother died. But then the father, who divorced from mother, who was living in Cuba, said, can I have my son back? It's a parental issue. And Cuban Americans were like, no, that would be sending him back to some communist country and so forth. That's terrible. What way did President Clinton ultimately decide? Give Elian Gonzalez back to his dad. His only living, direct relative and so forth, as opposed to his uncles and aunts who were living in the United States of America. Who did that upset? Probably a fair number of Cuban American voters. Well, was Bill Clinton on the ballot in 2000? No, but his vice president was. Al Gore was on the ballot, running for president. Did Al Gore win Florida? I mean, how close was it? It was like maybe, 300 or 400 votes total out of all of that? Yeah. So Florida does factor very importantly, Cuban issues factor very importantly in the American political thing. That's why you still can't buy a Cuban cigar in the United States. I don't know. Okay? All right, let's look at this. Put this down. The CIA. Oh, we know about the CIA. They're part of the United States of America. The CIA, under the directive of the president, secretly begins planning an overthrow attempt of the Cuban government. They have people training in Guatemala, a friendly Central American country. They're training for an attack, an invasion of Cuba, which is going to take a lot of coordination, right? Because do you have in Cuba a pretty decent-sized military resistance if a United States-supported invasion comes in? Absolutely. Absolutely. So will that invasion actually take place? Well, an interesting thing takes place. The invasion isn't ready to go during the time of Eisenhower, so it's still in the works when Kennedy shows up. He's a new president. He's the commander-in-chief. If the invasion takes place on his watch, he's responsible for it. Write this down. He's hesitant. He is hesitant because he's thinking, I don't want to have my fingerprints all over this, right? A lot of the people who are going to be doing the fighting are Cuban exiles, right? They're Cubans. They want to overthrow this now left-leaning Castro regime. But do they need support from the United States of America? Or can you just drop them on the shore and they're going to do the job? No. Here's the deal. It's one of those ones, you look at history, and Khrushchev actually looks and he goes, man, Kennedy, you're amateur. Because here is the invasion, how it ultimately goes forward. You'll see this in the video. The invasion takes place April 15th, 1961, or actually April 16th. They start moving forward April 16th, 1961. Okay? So early in Kennedy's administration. The landing takes place at a place in Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs, okay? And here is what happens. The Cuban exiles land, but they're not given much support that they need for a fight. Okay? Kennedy didn't want to send a lot of airplanes over with U.S. military insignia on it and the U.S. Navy and so forth because he didn't want to look like this is a U.S. invasion, because if it looks like it's a U.S. invasion, then the Cuban people might not like it, and you want the Cuban people to like it and so forth. But hey, how about this one? If you're going to commit to an invasion, how about if it works? Because if it's not going to work and you're not going to commit to it, don't do it. In fact, that's Kennedy's conclusion afterwards. He's like, man, I really kind of messed that up. It fails within 72 hours. Write that down. It fails. There's not enough logistical support for those Cuban exiles. They're either killed or quickly rounded up by the Cuban government, the Cuban military forces. Castro is ready for them. And basically, Kennedy admits to himself, how could I have been so stupid? Don't just take some plan by the previous administration and change it so that it doesn't look like you're involved in it, because guess what? You still look like you're involved in it, and you look like you're an amateur because it just didn't come across successfully. right? And now, what does Castro do? He says, hey, Khrushchev, I really need your support. Okay? And he's really interested, write this down, in exporting communism and revolution to other areas in Latin America and other areas of the world. He's got like, hey, you can try and do that in my country, United States. I'm going to try and do that in various different other parts and so forth. So keep an eye when we get to like Nicaragua and parts of Africa and so forth. Don't be surprised when the Cubans are involved. Okay? And, of course, what do the Cubans want? They want a really solid commitment to the defense of Cuba from the Soviet Union. So what kinds of things could Castro's new buddy, oh my gosh, they just look so chummy there. What kind of things could they provide to Cuba? How about forward-based nuclear missiles? All right, write that down. The Soviets send over military advisors, yada, yada, conventional military advisors and so forth. And, you know, we do expect that. But what Castro really wants, and he gets from Khrushchev, Khrushchev is willing to send medium-range missiles with nuclear warheads to be located in Cuba. So in the event that the United States would attack again, write that down. That was a possibility. If the United States fails once in the Bay of Pigs invasion, maybe they're going to try again. I don't know. Were military planners actually anticipating attacking Cuba potentially at some point in the future? I can tell you this, because my father-in-law, I may have mentioned this to you before, was in the United States Marine Corps in the 1960s. And when this whole thing went down in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was in training. He was going to be part of the second wave of landing by United States troops into Cuba. That never happened. It's a good thing, because if it had happened, you had U.S. military force on Cuba engaged in fighting with Soviet, or out in the sea, U.S. naval personnel engaged in fighting the Soviet naval personnel. Goodbye. Boom, boom, boom. And everyone understood that. Everyone understood it. But here's a key thing. Soviets, write this down. They didn't tell the rest of the world, certainly not the United States, that they were putting these missiles in. They did not tell us. They told the Cubans. I mean, the Cubans are like, yeah, bring them on in here. That gives us extra security. We can hit just about any place in the United States, certainly on the eastern seaboard. We can hit D.C. How long does it take a missile launched from Cuba to hit Washington, D.C.? Anybody know? Hours? No, minutes. Yes. Missiles are not like airplanes, man. You launch those things and they go. And they hone in on their targets and boom. So that's why forward-based, short-range, medium-range missiles are like really, really unnerving. But write this down. The Soviets were very aware that we had forward-based missiles too. Anybody know, where were our short and medium-range missiles near the Soviet border? What country was one of our allies that we had those missiles in? You're thinking, well, any of the Western European countries, you know, in West Germany. But we actually did have some in Turkey. Write that down. We had some in Turkey. What's Turkey's relationship to the United States and other Western European countries? Very important. Are they military allies? Are we military? Are we still today? It's one of the questionable military allies today because they've got a very repressive government today. But they're part of NATO. Turkey is part of NATO, and so we have land-based nuclear missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. I know. I always remember, like, some years ago, I was, you know, in an airplane flying across the United States of America, and I looked down, and I'm like, look at all those funny tracks, like, in the middle of nowhere. We have a lot of our intercontinental ballistic missiles in the American West, because, you know, you can't just drive up to them. And we actually try to disguise them by having lots of different potential, like, launching sites, and so the people with satellites and observation can't really tell where they are. Probably the best way, raise your hand if you know this. What's the best way to disguise your nuclear missiles in such a way that they don't even know where they are half the time, and you can move them very easily? Not yet. Not yet. Submarines. Yeah, you can park the submarine right up off the coast and take out potentially take out your enemy. Okay? I haven't gone over yet, have I? No. Okay. Can't they with Star Wars? We have the Space Force now, but I don't know. Will we get into that? I don't know. All right, so we've got those. July 1962. Write this down. July 1962. That is when the Soviet ships arrive, or more Soviet ships are heading over to Cuba with nuclear weapons. And there's 43,000 Soviet military personnel there for a variety of reasons, including those are the guys who are in charge of manning the nuclear missiles. Okay? How do we know? How do we know that they are there? Well, look at this picture. We took that picture. Do you know what kind of aircraft the United States flew over Cuban airspace to take that picture? We didn't have the stealth yet, and we didn't have drones yet. U-2, very good. U-2, the very high altitude plane. A U-2 flew over October 14, 1962. So October is very critical. October 1962, flew over Cuba and took pictures. And then the United States military personnel are looking at us going, what's that, what's that, what's that? As it turns out, write this down, we actually had a spy on the inside, a Soviet military general who could look at those pictures and tell us, this is critical information, and tell us, yeah, they got nukes. The Cubans have nukes. We got accurate information because of our spy network. Yeah, our spy. We had some. Didn't I show you the spy video last time? It's part of this one, I think. Yeah, it's part of this one. The spy video was awesome. It's awesome. All right, we'll finish out the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we'll get that on Google Classroom.